In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a collapsed medieval tower house, perfect for your games of Warhammer, Mordheim, and Age of Sigmar. This piece is designed to look great in a city environment or in the middle of a battlefield. Hey guys, welcome back to Eric's Hobby Workshop. Today we're going to be building another medieval fantasy style building that's going to fit right in with some of the other projects we've made on this channel previously. There's a lot of new cool techniques in here and some interesting spins on some old ones, so let's jump right into it. Before I start building, the first thing I do is I sketch out an idea for the building. At this stage, it's very loose and unstructured. I'm just trying to get the major shapes of the building and put some ideas down on the paper and see what looks good, see what works. As you can see at this stage, I had an idea to do sort of a broken tower. The round tower made its way into the final design, but obviously I didn't end up using the pointy roof. That's just happens sometimes. I'll have to do that in another build. Before we dive into Mordheim, let's take a journey into another fantasy world, the world of Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is an RPG-style mobile game where you battle your collection of heroes against a variety of enemies, clearing dungeons, collecting upgrades, and leveling up your heroes to become even more formidable. My favorite part about Raid is the beautiful artwork and character design, which I really dig. I love peering into the background of the stages as my characters do battle. Clearly some very talented people worked on this game, and it really shows. So Raid recently released its biggest ever update, the Doom Tower. It's a giant tower with 120 floors, a bunch of secret challenge rooms, and 12 seriously badass bosses to take on, and I've been having a blast with it so far. And that's not all. With a bunch of new champions coming soon and a bunch of new adventures coming up in February, along with some special Valentine's Day events, there's never been a better time to get started. So go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you'll get 50,000 silver, 50 gems, 1 energy refill, 1 clan boss key, 5 mystery shards, 1 day XP booster, and 1 free champion, Hexweaver. Now Hexweaver is a great champion to start with, so don't miss out. She will really put in work early in the game for you. So to start your adventure today, click the links in the description, and all that treasure that I mentioned will be waiting for you in your inbox, which you'll be able to find right in the top corner of the screen right here. Alright, let's get back to the build. I move to some XPS insulation foam, and I mark out the basic footprint of my building. Using this method means I don't have to use a base and then build on top of that. The entire bottom of the structure is going to be a solid piece of foam that's flat. So I use this tin of raisins and cut a nice circular tower shape, and then score the foam and break it into 2 roughly equal shapes, which will allow me to cut out the basic shape of my building, following the curve as closely as I can. And then of course I will take the second piece of foam and duplicate that. This is 1-inch XPS foam, so this gives me a nice 2 inches thick base to build my building on, which is a nice size for about a story at the 28mm scale. This is basically the first floor. So I'll use some Gorilla Glue construction adhesive, adding this to my foam pieces generously, and then coming in with a scrap of foam and spreading it around to lower the clearance and make sure every part of it's going to be stuck together. I stick that on, and then with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, I just mop up the sides and the workspace anywhere I might have gotten the extra. This construction glue is very sticky and will ruin your clothes or anything, so it's good to keep it nice and clean. Keeps the edges neater as well, which is a bonus. So using these offcuts from when I cut these pieces out, I'm now going to cut my bricks. Watch your fingers and cut smoothly with long strokes with as little of a sawing motion as you can, because you want to get nice smooth edges to these bricks. As I've said before, you can use a hot wire Proxxon cutter or any sophisticated tools you like, but you really just need a craft knife. Speaking of which, look what my craft knife did to this. This is a key sign that my knife is not sharp enough. So I'm going to switch that blade out. I switched the blade out a couple times during the course of this project. It's always good to have a nice sharp blade, and surprisingly, although this foam seems pretty soft, it does dull the blades decently quickly. So it's nice to be able to switch those out. And then as you can see with the fresh blade, I get a nice, much cleaner result. Just dicing through those. I'm cutting them in various sizes. Some of them are much smaller than others. Some are short, some are long, some are chubby, some are thin. And that's going to give a really nice variation to the wall when I start building it. And as you can see, I start gluing these on with my glue gun, making my way around the curve of that tower. And here I'm adding a piece of sandpaper to my workstation and taping it down with some duct tape. And the reason I'm doing this is so I can run a brick along the piece of abrasive sandpaper and bevel the edge a little bit. This will ensure the gaps between the stones as I go around this curved surface are the same width as the gaps along this flat wall here, to give a nice uniform appearance. So as you can see, I'm just laying bricks as I go along the structure. And before I get too far, I'm going to want to think about doors. So here's my box of Mordheim accessories and supplies. And here are two doors that I made in another project. One of them is from my tower project, which you can watch here. And I'm going to cut out a piece of the structure here because I decided I wanted this part to look collapsed. I cut a nice piece to act as sort of a rubble pile. And happy with that, I glue that on with some Gorilla Glue. Next, with my door, which is just made on a piece of foam card out of some coffee stir sticks and a bit of cardboard, I cut it in half. I originally made it double-sided, but I'm not going to need double-sided for this use, so I'll keep the other half for something else. Decide where I want it on my structure, and with a little bit of hot glue, I fix that on there. Next, I'm going to add a little bit more of an interesting shape to the structure by cutting out a nice block of my XPS foam and cutting an angled roofline along one side of it. Again, using hot glue, I'm going to attach this to the side of my structure, and that'll give a nice sort of butted out window structure piece on the side of my building. And when I brick around that, you'll never know it was a separate piece. Next, I'm going to make some windows. This is a window that I made before for another project, but I'll show you how to do it again. You take some matchsticks and you take some Sculpting Mesh. I'll put a link for this in the description down below. And you cut little lengths of matchstick, the right size for your windows. I didn't actually measure these, I always just eyeballed it. It's a good idea to compare it to a mini to decide how big the windows you make are going to be. But then using a bit of Aleene's Tacky Glue, which is a thick white PVA glue, I glue those together. And they'll dry nice and solid. So give them a bit of time to set up though, because you don't want to be messing around with these still wet sticky pieces. In the same style, I'll make a double window that's the same height as these other windows to tie in with them visually, but this one has a sill on the bottom made from a bit of coffee stir stick that will be a nice little lip shape. These are quite finicky to make, but I think they look great when they're done, so I think it's worth it. I keep bricking around my structure. As you might imagine, there's a lot of bricking in this project. I have no idea how many bricks that it used all said and done, but I imagine it was in the hundreds if not thousands. But that's part of the fun. So with my double window, I put it on these two sticks so it would lie flat because it has a protuberance from the windowsill. I cut a little bit of the Sculpting Mesh and then using super glue, I lay that on there. Now the Sculpting Mesh doesn't want to stick instantly, so it's a bit of a weird dance here where I push it down with this metal ruler and I keep the metal ruler kind of moving so it doesn't stick. And while I'm holding this down, I then sprinkle in some baking soda, which sets the super glue quickly and adds a nice crust that fills in some of the spaces. A super glue accelerant would probably work too, I've never used it, but there you go, you get a nice looking little window. The diamond pattern is good because you can line it up with the sides and make sure it ends up straight too, which is a nice little benefit. So here I am cutting out another round shape out of XPS foam with a little bit of a embankment from rubble as well, and then fitting that to my structure. I trim it to fit, and then same as before, I'm going to use a little bit of construction adhesive, spread that around, and stick the piece down. This is a really fun way to get some height. Some of you who live outside of North America might find this stuff expensive and think that this is a huge waste of foam. Where I live, the stuff's quite cheap, but if you didn't want to use this foam as the basis for your structure, you could use cardboard or whatever. Since you're covering it up with bricks, you don't need to use these big chunks in the interior. Here I'm switching to foam board. As an example, you could build the whole structure like this, and this is just for the gables of the roof line. It's much easier to cut it this way out of foam core than it would be to do the XPS foam. Next, I'm going to take the windows that I built, the ones that won't be visible on both sides that'll be up against a solid wall. I glue them to this piece of chipboard that I used for spray painting something because it's black in the background. By having it black in behind that mesh, that'll save me having to stab in there with a brush for when I paint it later. And here, as you can see, I continue bricking. Surprise, surprise, there's a lot of bricks to go. I add a nice stone lintel to the top of the door. This gives a nice sort of deliberate feel to the door. You really want to pay attention to the details around the doors and things like that. Make sure that your masonry is nice and neat on either side because it will draw the eye. Speaking of neat masonry, sometimes you get these weird uneven bricks and you just need to trim them flat so the layer above will also lay flat. This is one of the tricks that I use to make sure the stonework looks fairly even despite the bricks being of different sizes. So I continue adding bricks all along that curved tower, and I'm starting to get a sense for the structure and decide that it's time to add the windows. So I glue the windows directly to the foam underneath, as you can see, making sure that they line up nicely with each other. And the advantage of putting the windows on first is then you can build the stone right up to it and have it be nicely inset into the stone, which gives the building a really solid and realistic look. Decided to put double windows on the end here. This building actually has fewer windows than many buildings I've made before, and the reason for that is it's just a different style of building. I've been looking at various different reference images, and in some poorer quarters in medieval cities, the buildings have this really cool, thick, heavy stone appearance with these tiny little windows, and I just really like the way it looms up over the street and creates this sort of canyon-like streets and a real sense of solidity. So here I developed a new technique for doing the curved pieces on the tower corner. And this is to just cut my bricks on an angle from the start. You can see that they each have a slightly angled piece on one side now, based on that shape that I cut initially. And that's going to be a big help. That's easier than using that sandpaper the whole time. It's really coming together. Next step, I'm going to cut some little holes into the wall behind to represent support beams on the inside that would hold up the floors. This just adds a little bit of extra detail to this face, which is otherwise pretty flat apart from the windows. And so I just nick a little bit of a hole, and then I take some of this balsa wood, which is 3/16 of an inch, cut it into a few shortish segments. It's really helpful if you're going to cut this stuff to use one of these little miter boxes that I've got here. That'll make sure that your cuts on an angle or cuts flat are always nice and square and a nice angle that you want. I think I bought this hobby saw and the miter box together, so look out for that. It's a great tool in my arsenal. And here I'm just putting a bead of hot glue and then pushing those sticks in so they stick a little bit out further than the masonry, but add a nice little nubby detail That's gonna look killer when it's all painted up. And one more. Nice. Next I'll add some bricks in between them. And just to make sure the wall looks nice and level, I'm gonna cut the tops of those flush. More bricking, surprise, surprise. If you're gonna do a project like this, you really have to be in the right mentality because it will take a fair amount of time. I like to listen to audiobooks. During this, I was listening to The Eye of Terror as narrated by A Border Prince. Go check out A Border Prince's channel if you like 40k stuff. He's my favorite for listening to 40k lore while I'm working. It's really good stuff. He just reads Black Library stuff, short stories. He doesn't actually summarize his own lore, so there's no spoilers. It's just the stories as the authors originally intended them, and I appreciate that. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It's the best way to support the channel, and you can join our Discord server and see some behind the scenes things over there, so it's pretty cool. Check it out if you're interested. So as you can see here, I'm adding some beams to the structures that are sort of exposed by the collapsing process. And I'm just kind of doing what I think would look good. I wanted to have a few nubs sticking out, but I also wanted it to have some jutting, broken looking beams, and then a nice logical surface to put these coffee stir stick floorboards down on top of. And that ends up looking pretty nice, I think, and I'm pretty happy with that. And I put some more floorboards on the second story down there as well too. And then I come in with a bunch of Aleene's tacky glue. I'm not sure this was the right glue for this. It's better than white glue because it is nice and thick and bonds quite well, but I think construction adhesive would have been better. Because as you can see, I'm dumping a lot of my extra bricks on there to create the collapsed sort of rubble pile appearance. This worked fairly well. Some of the bricks only stuck by a small corner and so could have benefited from the extra strength of the construction adhesive. And as you can see here, I'm adding some pieces of broken timber and floorboard, which are the same materials as before, the coffee stir sticks. And, you know, I really would have benefited as well from covering the entire surface underneath with glue. I kind of did it sparingly because figuring, oh, that's where the bricks will stick. That makes sense. But here you see me with a paintbrush painting in the glue in the gaps where there's obvious gaps because I'm about to add a little bit of sand. And that actually turned out great. You underestimate my power. So a foremost concern when you're building something like this should always be playability. You want guys to be able to stand on it and interact with it. And luckily this guy can stand down here on the rubble pile pretty well. He can obviously stand on the platform up here, but I'd like there to be a little area in here where he can stand. So while the glue's still wet, I just push some of the bricks aside to make a nice little ledge so he can perch in there naturally, end his turn sort of not at the top or at the bottom if need be. And I'm continuing along the curve of this building. As you can see, we've risen above the solid core inside, and so this part will really sell the feeling of a skeletal shattered tower. This is the one window that I made double-sided because as you can see, it's visible from both sides. So basically all I did there was I doubled up on the window frame, but other than that it's the same as the others. And we're getting bloody close to finishing these bricks. I can't tell you how satisfying this was in person to do this. It's just, you know, after doing this many bricks, gosh, feels good. So this is something to be concerned about. These strings from the hot glue gun, if you pull them taut and then pull them away, you should be able to pull them away cleanly, but you definitely want to take a moment to remove those before you get into the painting stage because they'll look really stupid when they're painted. As you can see, I'm overlapping the gables here, and this is why. I'm going to come in with a very sharp hobby knife, just using the sort of foam core piece in behind as a guide. And I'm going to get a nice, smooth cut. Yeah, this footage is not as smooth as I remember it. I remember it going quite smoothly when I did this. But yeah, here I am stopping and starting. I think I did a little bit better on some of the other ones. You can do it. See, it's still very satisfying, even though it was quite slow. But yeah, Beautiful, beautiful. There are actually, in some medieval style buildings, particularly in Belgium, they have this sort of gable that actually overlaps the roof vertically. In some of it's similar to the appearance of this untrimmed gable here before I cut it. And if you don't know what I mean, that's okay. But that is a style that I might play around with in future builds because it's quite appealing looking too. But you really need sort of a regular brick exterior, so I didn't go for it on this one. Make sure if you're doing this like this that you don't undercut and cut the bricks lower than the level of the roof, because it'll just look weird when you put your other roof on. There'll be a little gap there, it won't look good. So take your time, get a nice smooth cut. You don't want to rip or tear these things as you go. Foam can be a little bit temperamental and it takes some getting used to. I'm starting to get used to it and I'm feeling pretty good about it. Next, I use a piece of chipboard and just kind of eyeball the overhang that I think I would like. I cut a rough piece and I cut it a little bit wider than I would think it might need to be. And then once I put it in place, I can eyeball it and trim it if need be. And this is just going to be the basis of the shingles that I'm going to put on in a moment. As you can see, I just put a small amount of glue in the center. That was kind of a cautionary thing in case I wanted to rip that piece off and play around with it more. I didn't end up doing that. It's strong enough as is, but you don't always need to overdo the glue. It gives you more options. So for the other roof, I used 2 pieces of chipboard and taped them in the center with a piece of duct tape. This gives the flexibility for them to stay joined at the top, but also be quite rigid pieces without having to fold it or anything. It's kind of the best way to do it. All right, shingles. I've done shingles on this channel before, but I just came up with a new method and it's totally tight. Check this out. You cut yourself a piece of cereal box. Doesn't have to be all brand. All brand's one of the worst cereals. I don't even know how this got in my house. Don't at me. But yeah, then I measure out some half inch. No, what are the measurements here? It's 1.5 centimeter by 1/4 inch. So mixing metric and imperial. And you can see I'm just nicking the edge of the piece here. And then I cut off a strip. And when you look at that, you'll see that it's just cut halfway through, so you get a row of shingles. I used to do this by hand with scissors and it takes much longer. This method is so fast. I'm so pleased with this method. More shingled buildings are coming, let me tell you, because I'm stoked about this. So what I like to do is bend back every other shingle in a row and just trim them with a pair of scissors. And what that's going to do is change the lengths of them and give them a little bit of texture and a little bit of visual interest. And yeah, make a big pile of those because you need a lot of them. Each row is going to overlap the one below it by half. And so you need kind of double the surface area of your roof in shingles, if that makes sense. Just working from the bottom, going up, I like to use hot glue for this. There's a little bit of time to move it around, but not much, so you don't have to worry about the whole roof sliding around, but it doesn't bond instantly like super glue would or something. And then I obviously put that main rooftop on there and start shingling this roof. What you might notice me doing is sometimes I rip the sheets into smaller pieces, and that allows me to space out the shingles a little more, which gives a little bit of a ramshackle appearance. I don't want to go too ramshackle, but it helps with that. Now, because I felt the roof was a bit plain, I'm cutting a nice hole in one side here. And you can see I just sketched out the area with a pencil first. But I glue a piece of stick to the roof before I fully cut it out, and that's just so that piece doesn't fall inside when I cut it. I can just remove it like a lollipop there on that stick. Pretty clever, eh? Now doing something similar, I take a piece of balsa wood and glue it to another piece of balsa wood, and this will allow me to place it in behind like building a ship in a bottle or something like that. Now I know what you're thinking. This would have been much easier if you had just built that on the inside before putting the roof on. And of course, you would be right. But I didn't know I wanted to do that beforehand. So this is an alternative method if you want to do it the hard way. And on that protuberant roof beam, I'll put a little bit of, I guess you call that a lath or something, a little bit of planking, just a hint of the construction method. As you can see, it suggests a whole roof and a whole construction method without having to do all that. Here I am building a chimney on just a small piece of foam as sort of the core for it, and then I cut that on a nice angle. It's not quite 45 degree, whatever the roof is, same angle as that. I want it to be nice and level, and I glue that on there. You want to put the chimney down before the shingles. If your chimney is floating on top of the shingles, it'll look a little bit weird. Not too bad, but you know what? You might as well do it properly. So, adding some more bricks on the chimney, just to get a nice little bit of height. The chimney might have ended up too thick, but that's neither here nor there. So here I'm cutting a piece of folded card to do the tip top of the roof. Right along the top of the roof line, I'm gonna do some overlapping arch-shaped shingles that'll just give it a nice polished look right on the top there. Here I'm adding a final detail to the door. I'm adding a little loop from a piece of chain onto a tiny piece of chipboard, moving that around with a pen while I still can, and then adding a little curved piece of cardboard on top, and that makes a serviceable handle. Nothing too crazy, but adds a nice little bit of detail right on there. It looks a little clunky, but I'm happy with it. It works out. And just as a final detail, I'm adding a little bit of flashing around the chimney. The ones on the side I'm not so sure about, but the piece at the bottom I really like. And it just shows, you know, this house is in pretty good condition and well cared for. It makes a really nice contrast to the totally toasted, trashed building next door that's completely collapsed. Maybe one of them had a pact with the dark power and one of them didn't, or something like that. It's fun to think about those things. Anyways, so next I'm going to use this odorless gray spray paint, which is nice and foam safe. Spray that whole thing gray. And as I've said before, this is my favorite part of a project. It really comes together when you get the base coat on and hide that accursed pink appearance that, although I am fond of, it's nice to see it get painted. So I come in carefully with some burnt umber. It's worth taking your time to do the brown here, because then you don't have to bother touching up any of the gray. And with a really light brown wash, I do some streaking just to add a little bit of variation to this stone appearance. And then I come in with a thin black wash all over everything. This actually dries quite a bit lighter than it goes on, so I was pretty sparing with it and did a couple coats. Next you see me using some green wash sort of at the base of the building to add that mossy, overgrown, damp sort of feel. And then I come in with a nice soft makeup brush to add some white highlights to sort of act as the highest value that really picks out the final detail of these stones. If you haven't dry brushed with a makeup brush before, you're missing out. It's just so much better than a bristly, stiff brush, especially for something like this where you could dislodge a brick or something by brushing it too hard. And now here, I'm just painting some black paint into the windows to give them the look of the lights being off inside, adding a bit of gunmetal mixed with black to make a wrought iron sort of appearance on my flashing and on the hardware on my door. And that's it, guys. That's the final detail.